so glad that you were able to return. If you saw the first part of our little mini-series here, delivered by Ken, who I think you all know well. It's so exciting to listen to him talk about a new project. And as I mentioned last time, some of you maybe were not here, this year we're trying to give our speakers the opportunity to really dive in deep to a subject that they're already very invested in. And in this case, this is an exhibition project that's developing. So, you know, the point is to be able to enjoy the process, because as curators will often tell you, it's the process of making exhibitions that really is the most delightful, and it's nice to be able to bring you all along for the ride. I'm going to give Ken as much time as possible. As you could tell from last week, he does have a lot of material to deliver. He's going to give a slight recapitulation, just a little mini recap of what he went through last week, and then we'll go forward with the real fun stuff. I'm not a big papyrus person, only because I like visual art too much, and I was at the Walters when we were involved in the Archimedes palimpsest, which was a very dried up, poopy looking brown thing that actually contained vital information, because it did have lost Archimedes, you know, formulations. But to hear people talk about it, because I'm an art historian and I like paintings, it was really difficult because they look like little poopy brown things. So, you know, fortunately this week we get to look at something besides the dry, charred, sausage-like, burned up things that are the Papiri, and see some really nice sculpture. So without further ado, we're really looking forward to this. Help me welcome Ken back to the stage.
And thank you all for coming back out on what is another gorgeous Southern California day. It was the really climatic parallels between the Bay of Naples and Southern California that inspired J. Paul Getty to build the villa in the form of the Villa dei Papiri in Herculaneum. And it is an exhibition on the villa and its spectacular and very important finds, as well as its literally, pun intended, groundbreaking excavations and the beginnings of scientific archaeology in the 18th century that we want to communicate to our audience, including you, by bringing the original works from the Bay of Naples to Malibu in 2019. And we've been thinking about it for a long time. You may recall that a few years ago that Getty had a few issues with the Republic of Italy. Those have been sorted out to everyone's satisfaction. So now we're in a position to really bring a lot of material from the Bay of Naples here. And in fact, in a couple of weeks, I'll be in Naples beginning to, we have agreements, informal agreements with all authorities to do this exhibition, and I'll be trying to pin down precise loans. So the invitation from Mike to present these two lectures have been really useful to me to really gather together what's possible and available and put my head around the state of our knowledge as we dig in and focus further. So last week, I know I sort of gave you a lot of information, and I think I'm going to give you a lot today. The exhibition will be much smaller and more focused, and I'm working on that, but a lot of that depends on what our Italian colleagues want to lend and what stories, there are a lot of stories to tell. There's the archaeological history story we talked about with Carl Weber, there's the story of the papyri, there's the architecture, which isn't movable, but we have the Getty Villa, and the bulk of the material will be the sculpture, and that's what I'll talk about mostly today. So just to recap, that's the pointer, that's the vent. So these are the themes more or less of the talk. I talk about the different phases of the building. It exists at different points in time, basically three. Antiquity, when it was lived in and destroyed. The 18th century, when it was excavated, because most of it is still underground, and today, when it's been partially re-excavated and there's new research in various fields about the sculpture, about the architecture, and particularly about the digital unscrolling of those poopy papyri. And in the lecture, we've looked a lot at Herculaneum. In the second half of today's lecture, we'll also look at how the villa has had a broader influence and continues to away from Herculaneum. So just to remind you, yeah, we've got our own little Gentleman Light Show. Herculaneum is south of Naples, just west of Mount Vesuvius, much closer to the volcano than Pompeii. It was buried differently than Pompeii because Pompeii was buried mostly by ash, and this is not a smudge, but this, you'll remember, is the ash cloud. The wind was blowing south and buried Pompeii lightly in ash, whereas Herculaneum was smothered by pyroclastic flow, accounting for different preservation and different depth. Here's the site that was excavated open air in the 1920s. Part of the site and the villa itself was excavated through tunneling in the 1750s, and here's big Vesuvius with its column blown out, still really looming over the site. Here's what happens with a massive volcano. The ash goes up. With Vesuvius, the wind was blowing south, so this ash went that way. When the column collapses, pyroclastic flow comes racing down at hundreds of miles an hour with hot gases, debris, picking up trees, knocking things over, sort of flash frying things, but unlike lava, which would burn and melt and destroy, it actually preserves. And this is, I showed last time, Mount Pinatubo, and so this is what people on the slopes of Vesuvius eventually faced, but some hours after the eruption began, because the eruption first had that big cloud above, and it's only when that cloud collapses. So this is the villa. One little bit of it has been excavated using modern techniques in the 1990s and early 2000s, and you see all of this is the volcanic overburden from AD 79. This is the volcanic lava overburden from 1631. So it's very, very deep. And this, the whole villa was excavated by tunnels, and this has been massive clearing today. So what we really know about the architecture, or knew until these new excavations, was from the plan drawn by Karl Weber, the Swiss mining engineer, and he started here at the Belvedere digging tunnels. They sunk other shafts at later points, so they didn't progress strictly from south is north, so that would be from south is north, I'm sorry, south is above here, so that would be from west to east, right? But they didn't do that. They sunk some other shafts at various points, so they came from different directions with his crew of convicts, conscripts, and I think some poor soldiers who were forced to dig in these dark, dank tunnels, revealing floors, sometimes breaking through walls. Here you see a little bit of an ancient column of brick that was stuccoed over that they found. So Weber, we're very grateful to him. He actually mapped the site, which was revolutionary at the time. Usually people just wanted the goodies and brought them up. And he got in trouble with his superiors for taking too long because he was doing what we archaeologists would like him to do, which is to record context. We know a lot about what the villa might have looked like from other villas that have been excavated, and especially from wall paintings. This is just a selection from different buildings in the Bay of Naples that the Romans put on their walls of seaside villas with grand colonnades, porticos, little docks, boats. So these help us to reconstruct. And the Getty Villa itself is kind of a pastiche. The plan is based on Weber, but the elevations are taken from a variety of different buildings. So it's not an exact replica, although it's a one-to-one replica in scale. The scale of the Villa dei Papiri is huge. This is the ancient coastline that's been filled in by various eruptions. This is Herculaneum, the site. with city blocks, and here's the villa along the coastline, and it continued to about here. So massive building with a lot of nice sea frontage, building a very, very high prestige. And you can see here how it maps onto the Getty Villa. There are other buildings back here where the papyri were found. This walkway to the Belvedere here that weren't reproduced in Malibu. And there are other changes in Malibu. These two elements, the inner square peristyle and the atrium block, have been flipped by Getty's architects to fit the canyon topography of the Malibu site. So these are some of the differences between the two sites, but it really does give us the feel of moving in those spaces. The finds were many, sculpture in bronze and marble, which I'll talk about mostly today, the largest single collection of ancient sculpture from a site that we have from anywhere. Also wall paintings, many of which in the practice of the 18th century were cut out of walls and made into panels that were given to the king and are now in the Naples Museum. Also, those wonderful paintings we talked about, charred papyri, which, when unrolled, were the works of mostly, but not exclusively, this philosopher and poet, Philodemus of Gadara, one of the followers of Epirus, who was the client of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, the father-in-law of Julius Caesar, a very, very high-ranking Roman. And so we think we have Philodemus's library, that the building would have been one of several luxury residences owned by Piso, who died the year after Caesar in 43 BC. It was likely inherited by his son, who was also called Lucius Calpurnius Piso. We call him Lucius Calpurnius Piso Pontifex because he became one of the priests of Rome, and whereas his father was consul, equivalent of prime minister, Pontifex too was consul. He was a high-ranking official. He survived all the civil wars, high-ranking official under the Emperor Augustus and Tiberius. He was the prefect of the city of Rome. He was the patron of the poet Horace. And we have this portrait of him in bronze from Herculaneum. Its find spot isn't well recorded, but we know it's him because we have other marble statues of him with inscriptions. So, and it's this link between Piso or the Pisones and Caesar that inspired Getty. So this is the new digital reconstruction of the villa based on the new excavations, which show that it had multiple stories. Weber only recorded one, and this seaside pavilion down here, which the study of the architecture suggests was built about 2 generations after the villa. The villa seems to have been built not as was previously thought in different blocks additively, but pretty much all at once around 40 BC. Probably a little earlier if it was built by Piso himself, who died in 43. We have a precise historical date for Piso's life, where these archaeological dates for the building are much vaguer. But this pavilion here seems to have been built around the time of Emperor Augustus, so maybe this was added on by the son. And we looked at some of the spectacular floors that were not recorded by Weber that have been found in the re-excavations, mosaics in different patterns. We also looked at some of the spectacular marble floors that were recorded by Weber. This one was lifted and is now in the Naples Museum. And we have a replica of it at the Getty Villa, and you can buy umbrellas and notebooks and postcards in Malibu. But this is a view back the other way from the Belvedere towards the villa, and the reconstruction shows you how it was right on the sea. We also looked at some of the wall paintings that were detached by Weber last time. The still lifes, the Amorini, even this kind of illusionistic lion's head door knocker. I showed you this, and I apologize for the quality of the slide, which isn't very good. Still in situ, large-scale painting. This is a half-nude female figure. There's her navel and some drapery. It's not well preserved, but it's the kind of thing we know from elsewhere in the Bay of Naples. I mentioned but didn't show you, I inserted a slide of the Villa of the Mysteries. So there was this very, very grand painting of various styles at the villa. And what I didn't show you also were two of the finds that were detached that I'm hoping to bring here, because I can't bring things still attached to the walls. These two fragmentary panels, one here and one here, in the so-called second style, the illusionistic style of Roman wall painting, where we have a wall of a building, a window through which, as if from outdoors, is growing a garland, and then up on a cornice, leaning, there is a framed picture with shutters, like an old master painting, illusionistically depicted with shutters to protect it. And then the other panel from another room in the atrium level of the villa shows windows looking out to colonnaded architecture, very fancy columns, cornices with griffins and Nike, and here, as up on a shelf, a glass bowl of grapes and pomegranate leaves. Very, very delicately done, just up in the corner of the wall. There are lots of other elements, a hanging shield. So very luxurious painting at the villa, and fortunately, we'll be able to bring some of these things here. I also hope to bring some of these spectacular ivories I showed you here, blown up way out of scale. They're about this big. They're part of luxury furniture with Dionysiac themes, cupids making sacrifices at altars, panpipes, palm trees, herms of satyrs, and these, after much study, seem to be parts of luxurious tripods, which are ritual objects, but here they're luxury furniture, and they're probably part of, very nice household decoration that were swept down from the volcano. They were found in that new area, the swimming pool, but we don't know where they were originally located. This is a painting from a different Pompeian building. And lastly, we talked a little bit about the advances in the papyri over the years. One of the through themes of the exhibition, I want to emphasize how this one building has been so important for over 2.5 centuries as kind of a laboratory for archaeology and archaeological science in the recovery of the past. From these, basically inventing new techniques for unscrolling and trying to read burnt and broken papyri, to using modern technologies of laser scanning, in which they don't look maybe quite as poopy, but once we get to digitally unscroll them and find text on them, this has people very, very excited. So that brings us to what we haven't talked about, which is the sculpture. Weber started digging here. His tunnels went in various ways, and he annotated, which is in Spanish, on this plan, marking different things he found. And the first statues that he found were just a little bit in at D. You see, he says, in Spanish, 4 statues of bronze on the 28th of January 1751, and they present cupids with dolphins and jars, and these are little fountain figures in bronze about so high. 4 of them were found here. I'm not going to go through the order of Weber's excavations, day by day, year by year. There are so many ways to slice the pie, and the way I've decided to do it for this presentation is kind of thematically, and I have some ideas about how to do it in the galleries, but we're still working there, and a lot of that, as I said, depends on precisely what we get from Naples. I have a very, very ambitious wish list. It's over-ambitious because I know there are sacrificial victims in there. It's like, oh, you won't send me that? Okay, I'll do without it. But I put it on the list, so if I ask for the B list, they'll give me the C list. So I have to ask for the A list to get some of the A list and the B list. It's a negotiating technique. But today, I'm just going to give you an overview, again, of the villa, and some of the themes I'm talking about will certainly be in the exhibition, knock wood, that I get what I want. So more of these figures, another well was sunk, were found right around the atrium a couple of years later, and you see lots of them very similar. And these are made, again, in pieces from molds for bronzes. We have this idea, because they so rarely survive, because the metal was valuable and recyclable, that bronzes are unique originals and important works. We don't have them, and we often think of Greek bronze original and Roman marble copy. But the Greek bronzes themselves, or the Roman bronzes, are copies because they're made from molds. And if you look at these statues, they're different. The mask moves from one side to another. One holds a dolphin, one holds a jar. But if you start looking at details like the lower legs of these two figures, they're made in the same molds, and it's mix and match, flip booking them. So a patron could come and say, I want 4, I want 8, I want 12. And the artist working with the waxes would assemble them and then from molds, and then remold them, melt out the wax and form the bronze. That's the lost wax technique. So we have these little charming Cupid figures with Dionysiac masks, Dionysus, god of wine in theater, also wine skins, dolphins, and they are decorative, in various places around water features. Weber, in some points, just says A, B, C. In other places, for important finds, he actually draws the statues. You can see them in the plan, in the find spots. And these 5 statues, here marked in Roman numerals for 4, I always forget the dates, were found in April, May, June, and July of 1754. So here they're moving from our left to the right, which is from maybe west to east or east to west. I always get confused because my villa in Malibu was oriented 90 degrees off, so I have to rethink, am I talking about the Malibu villa or am I talking about the Herculaneum villa? So these 4 were found a month apart. This one here was found 2 years later. You also can see how the tunnels were dug, little explorations looking for things. And this big kind of excavation area is because rather than, when they began, they were lifting all the dirt to the surface. And this was a lot of work. They're 75 feet below the earth. And they were also getting complaints from the locals because buildings were on top and the ground was shifting. So they started backfilling or moving the dirt around down below. So when they did the re-exploration of the villa in the 90s and 2000s, they started to clear some of those tunnels of the debris that had been backfilled by Weber's workmen. But here you can actually make out the figures of these 5 statues, which are among the most famous from Herculaneum. They're often called the Herculaneum Dancers, but they're not really dancing. I mean, who dances like this? That's not dancing. They've been called nymphs, muses. They're often called Danaids. Danaids are mythological figures, the daughter of King Danaus, who all but one of the 50 of them murdered their husbands, and then were, it's nice. It's one of those lovely mythological stories. It's always domestic violence in Greek. But their punishment was having to to move water in leaky vessels. And the reason they've been called Danaids is we know that the Emperor Augustus had a group of Danaids on the Palatine in Rome, near his palace in the Temple of Apollo. But those figures, we have what we think are a few of them. I guess I'm going to tell that story later. We'll come back to the Danaids. We're still in the excavation story. At the end of the big pool in outer Peristyle, more statues were found. And this one, you can see the drawings, quite accurate. It's one of the runners. This is the problem. If I don't look at my screen, I don't see what's coming next. And I lose track of myself. So these figures, we think of them as runners. Perhaps it's better to call them athletes. In the 18th and 19th century, they were often interpreted as wrestlers, because if you turn them facing each other, they might be wrestlers beginning their match. But the new thought is that they're runners running parallel to one another. And one of the other statues found here is the very famous statue of Mercury or Hermes. The rock is modern, but he's just sort of alighted. He has his winged sandals that even have a rosette on the bottom because he doesn't have to touch the earth. He can fly everywhere. This is on my list. If it comes, I'll be amazed, but I'm leaving it on the list because it's like, oh, you can't send me that? Okay, well then maybe you'll give me, the two runners. I very much doubt I'll get both him or the runners, and I'll be happy with either, but that will change the story, part of the story I tell. But these are all life-size bronzes, life-size for God, so these are the size of you or I, and we have replicas of these all in the gardens of the Getty Villa. So basically there are 3 zones of the villa that have sculptural decoration, and if we try to think, as people have, of a sculptural program, how the sculptures operate and talk to each other and communicate significant messages. So the first is the large rectangular or outer peristyle garden here, and we've just been looking at the so-called dancers that were found there, and the athletes and the Mercury that were found there, and we'll look at some of the statues that were found there a little bit later on. The second zone is the so-called inner or square peristyle garden, and some of the rooms between it and the outer peristyle. And then the third zone is the atrium area, and it's this area just in here that was re-excavated in the 2000s, but Weber had fully explored it. The fourth zone is that new excavation area with the pool. 2 stunning marbles were found there, but they weren't found in their ancient spots. They were probably swept down by the volcanic flow. This Amazon head, the body is maybe somewhere it's broken, and this well-preserved female figure of a goddess in high classical style, harking back to the works of 5th century Greece. So this is a zone where sculpture was found. It probably wasn't displayed down there. It could have been on one of the terraces up above. But we'll be looking really more at the finds from these areas, because that's where Weber recorded their find spots. So and I'm going to toggle between statue types and find spots. So what is the content? We have gods and goddesses there, and we have actually some repetitions. Here are 2 figures of Athena, Minerva to the Romans, but when in the Bay of Naples, Romans often took off their togas and put on their hematia, their Greek mantles, and they spoke Greek. There was a resident philosopher, Philodemus. I used the analogy of New Yorkers going to the Hamptons. They're still operating with their peers, but they're doing it in a slightly more relaxed way, but they're still showing off and doing business with one another. So we have Athena, we have an Athena bust. She's there wearing her helmet, here in a very idealized classicizing form. This large figure is in an archaic style, archaistic, looking backwards with the more rigid kind of stylized drapery. This is carved out of one huge, this is over life size. Here's a life-size runner, one of the Herculaneum Dancers in the background. And she is huge, and all this marble was carved away. And she's looking back to a much earlier type, going back to the 6th century BC in Greece, particularly Athens. This is a figure from one of the Pan-Athenaic prize amphorae, the vases made in Athens to be filled with oil to give to victors in the game. And you see her very fancy drapery with the zigzag folds. She would have had a spear. Here she has a shield. Here she's using her aegis extended with the Medusa head and snakes as a protective thing. So this is a reckoning back to the glories of Athens, and this statue was found in the transition between the inner and outer peristyle, kind of commanding. And Athena, of course, is not only the goddess of war, but also the goddess of wisdom. So very appropriate, as we know from Cicero's letters, for somebody interested in philosophy. for the life of the mind. So we have Athena in different forms, and some other gods as well. We also have the flip side, the thing Cicero doesn't want when he writes his letters to Atticus, ordering statues from Greece for his villas. He doesn't want Dionysiac themes. We have these two splendid bronzes of satyrs. Again, showing contrast. We have the older satyr who is leaning back, who's drunken and alert. We have the younger satyr, who I think has been mismounted. I think he's too upright. I think he also should be leaning back for reasons I'll show you in a moment. But he's actually, he's worn out and he's kind of sleeping. They're half men, they're half beasts. He has like the wattles of goats. Again, the rocks are modern. This one has a whole lion skin and a wine bag. That's partially restored. This is the only object that right now, today, I know for certain is coming to the exhibition. Because it's going to come early, and my colleagues in the Getty's Conservation Department are going to study it, try to determine. We know that a lot of the wineskin was restored in the 18th century. We're going to look at it for its ancient manufacturing techniques as well as its early modern restorations, and we're going to try to stabilize it for Naples. So the agreements have already been signed. This piece, which has never left Naples, will come to Malibu. And therefore, I'm not asking for this one. We have to leave something for them in their own museum. But you know, the types are well-known types, and the young sleeping satyr has a very good parallel in marble in the so-called Barberini faun from Rome, now in Munich. And you can see how the pose is really quite similar. The legs are reversed, but he probably should be leaning back further. And you can see that in this case, the marble, I would argue, is of much higher quality than the bronze. But here is a contrast of the two heads. They're wearing these wreaths. The drunken satyr is alert and smiling with his teeth bared, eyes open. The younger one has drunk too much and he can't. He's further gone. And his eyes are closed and droopy-eyed. So throughout the villa, we'll see these comparisons and contrasts, which ultimately would give fodder for conversations of people walking through the gardens discussing different topics. We also have famous works of art, the old masters. The Athena is kind of that kind of thing, but these two Herm busts, extractions, we're used to these just heads, have been taken from full-scale figures of the 5th century BC. These are very famous types. A male hero and a female figure who is an Amazon. And the male was, and they are signed actually. They're signed, only the male is signed in Greek. It says, Apollonius, the son of Archaeus, the Athenian, made this. So here we have the one signed work by a Greek, an Athenian, signed in Greek for the villa. And that seems to be signature. Maybe it applies to more than just this statue. This bust seems to have been made very much in the same workshop. Now what's interesting is that this statue is a version of a work of which we have almost 100 different replicas in marble, the so-called spear bearer, the Doryphorus of Polyclitus, which any of you who have been to Art History 101 knows. This is like the Michelangelo's David of ancient art. It's very, very famous. Polyclitus worked in the 5th century BC, the same time as Phidias worked in Athens. He's one of the greatest sculptors of ancient Greece. We don't have any original works by him. We have many Roman versions, and he was written about all the time. Plato references him in his dialogues, and we know that he even wrote a whole book about this statue, the spear bearer. This was called his canon. This is his ideal figure. And yet, at the Villa dei Papiri, the signature says, Apollonius, the son of Archaeus of Athens, made this. Well, it's like if you have in your house a version of the Mona Lisa, and it's signed, Fred of Santa Barbara painted this, right? Okay, what are you saying? I mean, and it's interesting to think what is being said here. The original, which is lost in Greece, was made of bronze. So Apollonius probably had access to molds, maybe not the original molds, but molds taken from the original. This version is a very high quality. There's all kinds of details in it that aren't in many of the marbles. I just call your attention to the hair, which rises in little points three-dimensionally, which is, of course, much easier to do in wax and cast in bronze than it is to carve in marble. So Apollonius seems to be making a claim, that he made this. This is advertisement for him. But it's also advertisement for the owner of the villa, that he has a good work of Greek sculpture by a Greek. One thing that's really interesting is we know a little bit about Apollonius because inscriptions found in the outskirts of Athens are signed not by Apollonius the son of Archias, but by Archias the son of Apollonius. So probably the father of this person, because names bounce from father to son to father to son, a sculptor who's working in Marathon. And we all know Marathon is famous. It's 26 miles outside of Athens. And so the signatures of Archias the son of Apollonius of Marathon. And there's even one of Apollonius the son of Archias of Marathon, who is either this guy or probably his grandfather. So we have their sculptures from Marathon, but when he's working in Italy, he signs as being from Athens, because wouldn't it be better to sign as Apollonius of Beverly Hills rather than Apollonius of Encino or something? So there's status for the artist, but there's also status for the buyer in having a work of Greek art. There's also these interesting contrasts. We have these two figures. We have the male and the female. This figure is an Amazon. If the Doryphus of Polyclitus, the spear bearer, actually represents Achilles, we could also have something like Achilles and Penthesilea and their tragic love, their opponents at Troy, but when Achilles, the moment he kills Penthesilea, he falls in love with her. So again, there's fodder for discussion about a lot of things. Old master sculpture, male and female virtues, mythology, collecting. These are all different topics that could be mobilized by seeing just these two sculptures which were found in the inner peristyle near one another. In addition to gods and heroes and Dionysiac subjects and old masters, there's also a little bit of animal sculpture. The lovely deers who are sacred to Artemis and Apollo, and the piglet. And the deer are today displayed on either side of the drunken satyr in Naples, and that's kind of like how they were found. Here's where the drunken satyr is, and here are the flying spots of the two deer. So they weren't exactly flanking. There was also, however, the leg of a third deer was found. So again, programmatically, things aren't as neat or as symmetrical as we museum curators might try to make them for our public, and I'll talk about that a bit more. The piglet is particularly interesting. It was found inside one of those rooms between the inner and outer peristyle, and I mentioned the pig being kind of an Epicurean symbol. Thrown at the Epicureans as an insult by others, taken on board and owned by them, so much that Horace calls himself a pig from Epicurus' side. So the piglet, the happy animal that can live for the day, that can enjoy pleasure, was represented in three-dimensional form at the villa. And I showed you last time from a different Roman villa, I won't bring it for the show, now in Paris, this one of two cups showing philosophers, now as skeletons. Again, enjoy life while you can, because this is how we're all going to end up. Epicurus is being attacked for eating too much cake. his maxim here, the goal of life is pleasure. Here the inscription saying this is Epirus is eating cake, and then at his feet is the piglet. So this pig idea is significant, and one of the more intriguing finds recently, the subject of a fascinating paper, found in the Villa dei Papiri is this small pocket-sized sundial in the form of a prosciutto. and the tail rose up, it's broken, would have formed the gnomon, and you hold it up and the shadow would be cast, and using this grid, depending on the time of year, could tell you the time, and it's accurate within about 10 minutes. It's kind of puzzling, it's very much a novelty, but what is the message here? You know, I think it has something to do with the passage of time. The pig becomes a prosciutto. You know, again, live life while you can. This is one of the few small finds that have been recorded and preserved. And this relates to the Papiri and the Epicurean themes, as do a series of small busts found in the same area. These are small. Most of the sculptures life-size. These are sort of desktop portraits, just like you can get desktop portraits of Beethoven, Mozart, and Wagner, or Shakespeare. Here you have desktop portraits of great philosophers. Some of them are inscribed. Here's Epicurus himself, Zeno, there's Metrodorus, this is Demosthenes. So these would be, you'd put them in a library or a reading room to demonstrate your intellectual pretensions or affinities or heroes. And there are a lot of, throughout the gardens, other sculptures of culture heroes, many of which we can't identify. They're not inscribed, and they're not well-known types. This type is very well-known. It's called by scholars the Pseudo Seneca because it was falsely thought to represent Seneca. It's not. Some people think it might be the Greek poet Hesiod, who was a pastoral poet, and that's why he's looking so rugged. Others say it might be the early Latin poet Ennius. We don't know who he is. Again, like the bronze herm of the Doryphoros, this is probably the highest quality of the dozens and dozens of replicas we have in other materials in marble from the Villa dei Papiri. It's a splendid, evocative portrait. It's probably a false portrait. Pliny writes about portraits of Homer and others that are invented. They're long dead. I mean, we have portraits of people like George Washington and Shakespeare because they would have been passed down by painters or engravings. But think for a minute about, I don't know, pictures of Jesus, right? They're really invented. We don't know what he looked like, but there's a typology. These are what we imagine these people to look like. And also from the villa, there are lots of portraits of guys wearing drapery with beards that are clearly intellectuals, but we don't know who they are. There are also a series of portraits that we do know who they are, and they're portraits of politicians and kings. And we know who they are because we have other portraits of them inscribed, and especially for the kings, we have their coin portraits with inscriptions that tell us who they are. So here we have Philotirus of Pergamon, who founds the great dynasty. If any of you saw the Pergamene show in New York at the Met a couple of years ago, he's the one that founded the dynasty. And this is Ptolemy Philadelphus II, who built the library at Alexandria. It was the culture war between the Ptolemies in Alexandria and the Attalids in Pergamum that gave rise to parchment, pergamena in Latin, because the Ptolemies embargoed papyrus. They wouldn't send any to Pergamum. So the Pergamenes, who were very wealthy, started using sheepskin as paper. This is how important literature was in those days. And this is Archidamus III, the king of Sparta. So we have in marble and bronze this gallery of politicians as well as philosophers from the Villa dei Papiri. Something that's really, really interesting is the kinds of portraits we usually find in Roman villas and Roman libraries of the great authors of ancient Greece, of Homer and Plato and Socrates and Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, or politicians like Pericles that are everywhere in the Roman world, we don't have them at the Villa dei Papiri. We've got these other people of the later period. These are people of the classical period, the canonical, great books authors. We have philosophers, Hellenistic kings, some we can't identify. This guy wearing the turban, we don't know who he is. He's been sometimes identified as Pythagoras, we don't know. This figure sometimes thought to be the early poet Thespis, maybe an Egyptian figure. Some people have even debated whether it's male or female. We don't have the inscriptions on the pillars that would have told us who these people are, that would have been helpful. And maybe with new excavations, we might find that and be able to identify some of these unknown figures. But they seem to relate to the Hellenistic world after the death of Alexander, the world that Rome inherited, interacted with, the world that Piso, when he was governor in Greece, was living with more immediately, historically, rather than looking way, way back to the classical past. And that's really interesting. So while several of the statues, like the Seneca or the Ripharos, we have in many versions, several of the statues, which are probably still replicas of other ancient types, we don't have examples of them. And we have, portraits of people that, again, are unique from this villa. We don't know exactly who they are, and that's puzzling. And then there are statues, again, with new research, we're learning more. This bronze, a much more veristic, realistic, warts and all style portrait, was been often thought to be a Roman. It's often been called Scipio Africanus, the great Roman general. He's got these wonderfully incised eyebrows. He's got close cropped hair. But recent research suggests that this deliberate incisions in his forehead, a kind of scarring, which exists on other portraits of bald or men with shaved heads, is a mark of being a priest of Isis, the Egyptian goddess whose cult was very widespread in the Hellenistic and Roman world. So there also seems to be a geographic component. We have kings of Sparta, of Pergamum in Turkey, of Egypt, of Sicily, and there's this sort of worldliness, and there's owning the world, something I talked about in the marbles that decorated the floors coming from different places. Here it's sort of outreach to insert oneself or to own the world culture. These eyes are made of bone and stone. Many of the eyes of the Villa dei Papiri portraits now are restored, having been put in the 18th century. The hollow eyes were inserted, and here I show you eyes. The one above is in the Getty collection. These two are in the Met. They're much earlier. They're from 5th and probably 4th century Greece, where you have stone, different colored stones, or stone and glass and obsidian set in envelopes of bronze that then would be trimmed at the edges to make lashes and inserted into the statues. So all these bronzes with hollow eyes, like the Lucius Calpurnius Piso here, you have to imagine them being shined up polished stone or bone or ivory or glass and looking very, very lifelike. And of course, the statues that are now green and brown and oxidized and corroded were bronze. They would have been the color of bronze, sort of tan skin of Mediterranean males, and the hair was probably patinated to be darker, so these would be polychrome figures. And sometimes the lips were done in copper and in other bronze statues, and sometimes teeth would even be silvered. So they would be much more lifelike in terms of color than they are now. So I return here to the younger Piso, and you can stand in for his father. When we think about, the program, what are the messages to be told? And I think it's important to think of messages and programs rather than a single program. And the first step in doing this is really to accurately plot and understand where the statues were found and what are the groupings and the conversations being had between the statues that could then engender conversations about the statues. And this is really a challenge because tracking exactly what Weber found where and how these things work. This is this is the first, Weber's plan wasn't published till about a century after his death. And this is an early kind of imagining of what the villa looked like in a book that's really about the Papiri, because the Papiri, I'm sorry, art historians generally lose to classical philologists. Words win over images and the intellectual hierarchy. But this is a plan in this book that is Tesoro Letterario de Herculaneum of 1858 that reconstructs, the outer rectangular peristyle, although kind of where things were found. At one end you have the drunken satyr, but he would have been near the villa. You have the two athletes here, almost as wrestlers, facing off across the large pool. They would have been more or less here. You have some of the Herculaneum women standing, at the end of the peristyle. If you'll remember, they were actually found inside the peristyle. So this is close, and then you have some busts put around. It was only really 50 years ago in 1971 when a Greek scholar named Demetrios Pandamalis tried to plot the find spots and argue for a program. And he worked to look at the sculpture program in light of the texts and look at a philosophical program. So he pasted in pictures. So here you see the deer and the satyrs. You see the women here, and things are put more or less where they were found. Here is the striding Pan-Athenaic Athena in marble. Here are the little philosophers, etc. And you can see that there are these significant pairings, like right here are these two, a very stiff, stylized figure thought to be an Apollo with a beautiful young woman who has a breast bare, maybe an Artemis, Apollo and Artemis, brother and sister, gods, male and female, also done in two different styles. These would allow for a kind of conversation. And Pandamalis, looked at various other, mostly pairings for oppositions and things. But there are some problems because you'll notice Pandamalis has this statue here. It was found there. Now, was it there and did it get moved there by the volcano? This is a problem we have. We don't have the statues on their pedestals, the Herm busts on their pillars with their inscriptions. How many of their find spots, when recorded by Weber, are their actual positions? And again, were they in their positions in AD 79? Were those the same as in 43 BC? Or did things get moved around? You've all rearranged things in your houses, right? So, there is a life to this, and messages can change over time. Here, for example, Pandamalis places two figures, a bearded philosopher, and I'll show you slides in a minute, and a younger man with horns who was a Hellenistic king. So we have a king and a philosopher combined. But if we go back to Weber's plan, and this is the cleaned up version with numbers, there were 4 statues found. And here, the middle, we have a bust of marble of natural size with horns on the head. I just mentioned, and then another which seems to be a philosopher, 5 and 6. But what is 4? Not in Pandormalice's plan. A satyr and a goat of marble joining together.
Love.
Yeah, we don't have this at the Getty Villa. But I want to bring it to the Getty Villa. Because if we're going to contextualize the sculpture, what is going on with these 3 sculptures? I think this is, in the Epicurean vein, kind of playful. It's kind of a joke. We have these 3 figures. We can identify him from coins. He's Demetrius Poliorcetes. He's one of the Hellenistic kings, a follower of Alexander the Great. And he has horns here, because he was styled himself the son of Poseidon, but horns are also symbols of goats and pans. He was, pun intended, horny. He was notorious in the ancient sources for his sexual escapades. This figure of a philosopher, we don't know quite who he is, a philosopher or a writer, but it's been suggested, and I think this is a pretty compelling suggestion, that he's a now largely forgotten but famous epic poet named Paniasis of Abdera. So you have Paniasis, Demetrius, who's horny, and you have Pan and the goats. So you've got this sort of visual literary play, a joke. And this might not have been the original collocation. Somebody could have come along and added the goats to the group, but this is how interpretations are born out. So it's through really trying to understand the groupings that we can begin to attempt some interpretation. And a problem arises when these collocations are moved around. This is a virtual reconstruction of the villa, and here you have the drunken satyr, and you have other statues sort of photoshopped in or digitally inserted. But, he's at the wrong end. He belongs there. So this gives us an idea of what the place looked like, but doesn't help us if we're trying to do something interpretively. This is another digital recreation of the villa, which has really, I think, been recreated backwards from the Getty Villa, where you have the I think the aspect ratio is off here, but that's okay. You have these Herculaneum women arranged around the inner peristyle pool, but they were found in the outer peristyle. At the Getty, we put them there because they look good there, and because some scholars have suggested that's where they belong, because they have these half-round bases that in this digital reconstruction, which is erroneous, they're little half-round bases, here we go, inside the pool. But they've been raised up. If they were without these platforms and the statues were on them, they'd be up to the waist or up to the neck in the water. And it's been suggested that these pools served not only as decorative fountains, but for breeding exotic fish that were great luxuries and served at banquets by Romans. And if you're raising fish, you don't just want a smooth line pool, you want little nooks and crannies where the fish can nest. So again, scholars and art historians with different agendas can push the evidence. They say, oh yes, we know these were found in the outer peristyle, but maybe they were moved there. Maybe they were really meant for there, and God, they look good there. Of course, we have only 5, and there are 6 niches, but maybe there's another one that Weber hasn't found yet. So there's a lot of special pleading. This brings us back to where my digression, there's that question of who are these figures. And they've been thought to be Danaids, so it's appropriate to put them next to the water. But the Danaids from Rome, the famous works mentioned by the ancient literary sources that Augustus built there, they took a different form. In fact, when John Singer Sargent went to do his famous murals for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and he painted the Danaids, he used these statues as his models, right, in the 1920s. course, he lived in Italy and he knew the statues. But Augustus's Danaids had a very different form. They were herms. And there were 50 of them, and people have wondered, could you have had 50 of them around the Villa dei Papiri? Or are these someone else, these Herculaneum women? And there are some theories that I'm exploring, trying to figure out maybe there's hope of a new interpretation. But as I said, the major line has been to look at these sculptures in terms of what we assume to be the philosophical aspirations of the owner of the villa, Epicurean philosophy. So we have things like a philosopher and a king. This we know is Ptolemy Philadelphus because we have his portrait. This we don't know who he is. He's been called Democritus and a bunch of other people. But you have the contrast of the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, of otium, life of leisure, of thoughtfulness, of relaxation, and neg otium, negotiate, business. So these oppositions seem to be implicit in some places. Also, we have, I mentioned this idea of geography of the Hellenistic courts. These aren't the standard images we see elsewhere, but we get a didactic purpose of ethical behavior. This is Perseus, of Epirus, which is now kind of the area of Croatia, Albania, who invaded southern Italy. We've also seen Archidamus of Sparta. The figure with the turban, we don't know who he is. Is he a philosopher, or is he representing part of the more Eastern world? So there's this geographical illusion. And some people have taken other interpretive lines that are maybe more allegorical or metaphorical about life as a race, about how you would set your goals and have an ethical course, and that these runners who would run down the outer peristyle past all of these figures from political and philosophical and literary and mythological history are kind of models for humans aiming for some greater ethical and intellectual good. These are all different interpretations. And then there's this interpretation, an Italian exemplification of a German Bildprogramm, image program. And I must say, I don't fully understand it myself. Amazon's athletes here, you have these the Danaids in the center and intersecting circles, and it'd be nice if we knew who these figures were before we started interpreting them. So one of the things to do is to come up with a useful map of the find spots, and I set one of our interns to actually take Weber's plan with numbers and then modern plans, and actually, and we're not there yet, make it interactive so you could have thumbnails of images and click on them big and see them not as numbers, not say, okay, what's number 1 and 4 have to do with each other, and then look up what is number 4, just to have something useful. Remarkably, this has not been done. Panda Release's photo montage is kind of the closest we've got, but as we see, he's left things out selectively. He doesn't do everything. But I think what's really important, and having spent now many years, wandering through the gardens of the villa, I think we have to think of not, as I said, a program, but programs that the owner of the house, or the brother-in-law of the owner of the house, or a high-ranking servant in the house would experience the statuary differently on different days at different times, moving from point A to B for something else, or deliberately walking the gardens in contemplation, or showing around a different visitor. You might avoid the pan and the goat that was over here if you've got a high-minded embassy of your fellow senators. You might bring them over here and look at great rulers from the past. If you have your philosophical friends, you might take them over here or into the inner peristyle to look at the philosophers. If you have a fellow art collector, you take him to see the Doryphoros and talk about that. Your first visit, you'd be taking everything in. Your second visit, you might want to make a beeline for certain things, or you'd see one piece here, in anticipation of another piece, here again, we have the drunken satyr here in the wrong place, and the younger satyr at the other end. But you only really can compare them once you've traversed the whole thing. So there's differences in how you experience the sculpture, depending on how you choose to move or are led around in space, but also temporally. Do you know what's coming, or is what's coming a surprise? And at different times, you'll have a very different experience. And in the show, of course, I can't bring from Naples all 90 sculptures. So my wish list has significant groupings, and I want to have works of the highest quality. Not all of them are so well preserved, so a good preservation, but that still retain at least exemplificatory groupings of some deliberate collocation, I might say. Now, these things were removed from the villa site. Now we're going to go to beyond. To the Museum Herculaneum at Portici, which is right next to Herculaneum, which is the royal palace, and they were put into a museum there. And they were restored. Some of them were not, and still remain in not very good shape. So we're missing not only statues that might still be in the ground, but we don't know who this woman was or what she looked like because her head is gone. But the Museum Herculaneum was much visited and highly praised in the 18th century. Goethe called it the alpha and the omega of all collections of antiquity. And this basically put the Neapolitan kings on the map on par with the great collectors in Rome or the Medici in Florence. They suddenly had classical antiquities. Winkelmann, Johann Winkelmann, the father of art history, he mentioned the women wearing the peploi, the Herculaneum Dancers, so-called, as displayed on the staircase there. He said that Pan and the goat were not displayed. The work was very famous, but he called it an obscene figure, which is not to be seen without a special license signed by His Majesty the King, and for which, as it had not yet been solicited by anyone else, I thought it did not become me to be the first to apply. These works were published by a whole team of scholars brought by the Neapolitan king in very various sumptuous volumes in Le Antiquità di Herculano Esposte, the Antiquity of Herculaneum Exposed. This is the frontispiece, many volumes published over the course of 40 years. You have images of Heracles, and in these vignettes, which I love, you have idealized pictures of Herculaneum before and after the eruption of Vesuvius. Very, very scholarly tomes. They were, here you see the King of Naples who underwrote them. They weren't available for sale. They were only available as diplomatic gifts. And here you see the shovel, you see the portrait of Epirus there, and here's the king. And they were published typologically. So here you see the bronzes, which were published in 2 volumes. The first volume was the busts, the second volume were the statues. And there were very good engravings, often showing multiple views. And here is that Herm bust signed by Apollonius. The Mercury, which is really meant to be seen in the round, got 4. These are big books with beautiful, beautiful engravings. He gets 4 views. So we'll have these in the exhibition. They come from the Getty Library, so I know I can get them. Here's the drunken satyr. Again, all shown after restoration. And these books were very quickly pirated and published in multiple languages with lesser quality illustrations for a much broader public. And these were pretty comprehensive. They had not only the wonderful big masterpieces, the various busts, but also the little putti figures. And from there, this repertory of sculpture entered more general literature. So here is Saint-Non's Voyage Pittoresque about his trip to Naples. And here you can see you have the drunken satyr and the Mercury set among other sculpture from the Bay of Naples. The problem is this statue is this big. This statue, fills the stage. There's no sense of scale. These things have become, very quickly, they get decontextualized. The Artemis is life-size from Pompeii. This is tiny. And some of this is discussed in the accompanying text. Around the time of Saint-Non, in the 1770s, the collection was transferred from the Museum Herculaneum at Herculaneum, or Portici nearby, to Naples, to what is now the National Archaeological Museum. And this is a very imaginative print. This is not how you transport works of art. But, they're put in crates and they're carried, and it took several years to move the collection, but it's shown as a procession with sculptures being carried to the new museum. And we have descriptions, and of course with the rise of photography, we can see how the sculpture was actually installed in the museum at Naples, and there's very good documentation. By the 1870s, Giuseppe Fiorelli, the great archaeologist who excavated much of Pompeii, who was in charge of the museum as well, installed this Sala di Capodope, the masterpiece hall of the Naples Museum. He installed it 20 years before this photo, and what you have is a mix of sculpture, the best sculpture from the museum's collection from everywhere. So you have the images of the Tyrannosides that came from Hadrian's villa. You have the Capua Aphrodite. You have the archaeistic Artemis, and here you have the Villa dei Papiri, Athena. So, and then you have the horse and rider from Herculaneum, from the city square. So it's all mixed together. The busts are pretty much together, but they're in a room. All the marble busts are together by medium. You have the room of bronzes, which has the satyr and the two athletes facing each other. But then you have all these other bronzes from Pompeii and Herculaneum from the cities. In time, from 1870, here's another view of that same room. You've got the Mercury, you can see it here are the female figures. But within 30 years, this room, which we can recognize by the moldings, it's the same room, gets thinned out. And here we actually have a more contextual display. These are the bronzes from the Villa dei Papiri. And this was done by Ettore Pais, who was the superintendent in the early 20th century. But the bronzes are still separate from the marbles. And somewhere in between, the Mercury here gets moved temporarily into the room with Pompeian frescoes. Because the museums are always shifting things around, whether it's for special exhibits or remodeling. In fact, in 2009, there was a special exhibit about Herculaneum, and they moved the runners downstairs to the main entry hall, and again, lined the corridor with the portrait busts. Today, there's a much more contextual installation in Naples. They put up the Weber plan. They have 4 rooms, and they dedicated those rooms to different parts of the villa. So this room is mostly the outer peristyle finds, but some of those connecting rooms, what we call the tablinum, between the inner and outer peristyle. But they also, today in Naples, very much like to do interventions with contemporary art. So you have a dying Batman in there with the Villa dei Papiri bronzes. I was thinking that maybe it's not a problem if I take a lot of the bronzes, because then I'll have more space for dying Batman. And here's more recently, they've done kind of a techno comic book style where they've done reinterpretations of famous figures from the villa. These sculptures also do travel quite a lot, but also piecemeal, and the Villa dei Papiri sculptures, being such outstanding works, are often featured, ironically, in Pompeii Exhibitions. They're not from Pompeii, but Pompeii, Herculaneum, it's all the same. This is an exhibition which recently toured in Canada, and Vesuvius is always the hero of every Pompeian narrative. And here, this was a giant screen that showed the volcano erupting, and one of the Paplophoroi, these women, is there in front. And it was kind of disconcerting because it was like, oh, the volcano's erupting, I better fit my dress because, the volcano's erupting. We had some of the busts in the big bronze show we had at the Getty. When it went to Washington, some of the statues we had couldn't go to Washington, and the National Gallery, using its diplomatic clout, got one of the two runners and put it in with the nude figures, and it kind of looked like he was streaking through the. No, we were glad they got him, but he was decontextualized. Usually they send one of him and they keep one in Naples. I very much hope to have two, and my exhibitions coordinator said, "But why do you need two?" I said, "The Romans needed two. And to understand them, you need to have two, and two have traveled. So there is precedent for that. They also have appeared in various other programmatic contexts. I remind you of Ingrid Bergman in Rossellini's Viaggio in Italia, where she goes to the Naples Museum and she's fascinated and disturbed by the ancient sculptures there. And this is her talking to the director of the museum, Amedeo Maiuri, during the filming of that. But almost more influential has been the work of various foundries, in particular the Fonderia Artistica Chiurazzi, based in Naples, which for generations has produced full-scale bronze replicas of these statues and has sold them around the world. The Getty has a very large set, but that was only acquired when the Getty Villa was built in the early 70s. But here you see them in odd places like Mount Stuart Castle in Scotland, where they're in this Gothic interior. Museums have bought them. The University of Pennsylvania has some. Here you see the athletes, the drunken satyr, and the Mercury, along with a reduced version of the Nike of Samothrace. This is a way of teaching the history of art. But they're also often used decoratively, such as the Morris Arboretum. The Mercury is very, very popular. He's also often very, very lonely, sitting there. Here are two other versions of him at Mount Holyoke or at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He's also at the John and Mabel Ringling Museum in Florida, which bought a huge set of bronzes from the Chiurazzi, not just other Villa dei Papiri statues like the younger satyr, but also things like the Laquan, which of course is a marble, not a bronze, but gets reproduced in bronze, or the Borghese warrior. Here you see one of the deer. Here you see one of the runners surrounded by shrubbery. One of the dancers surrounded by shrubbery. And this is funny, but actually, if we read Latin poetry, Statius talks about going through the gardens of villas and statues peeking out of the shrubbery. And things like, Pan and the goat would be appropriate in a rustic setting amid shrubbery. Yes. So maybe not quite like this, but there's something like that. This is versions on the Amalfi Coast, not far from Naples, the Villa Ruffalo, a lovely, lovely place, which is actually where Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini escaped from the press. We've got the dancers there. And they've got more. They also have the Mercury, and they have the Faun. The Fauns are very popular. Hitler's right-hand man, Hermann Göring, who was an avid hunter, had the Fauns at his hunting lodge, and the Fauns were actually taken to Berlin in the Second World War and then returned to Naples afterwards. There are also versions of the statues in Athens, here in Syntagma Square. We have the two athletes. These are not Kierazzi replicas. They're actually signed by a Greek sculptor, Dimitris Gavalas. Where he got the molds, I don't know. I haven't done that research, but you can see how widespread they are. And there are even versions of them in the round in the Museo Archeologico Virtuale in Herculaneum. They're the ones who did the wonderful computer restorations I've done. Also in Ercolano, in the town square, there are replicas of the dancers who haven't fared well. This is part of the ongoing kind of struggle between the archaeological site and the town, because so many visitors to the site, which are many fewer than Pompeii, come for an hour or two. They're day trippers. The town doesn't really see benefit from the tourism the way Florence does. Tourists come and go, they don't spend much money. There's this big hole in the ground in the middle of town. So there's, I think, some animus towards the archaeology, unfortunately. But more recently, in the entry hall to the archaeological site, new replicas have been installed. And that goes on. If you want some of these for yourself, just go online. If you've got 23,000 to spare, you can find the deer. These, are accurately identified as to their find spot, but other versions go unidentified. Just a Roman statesman or a classical maiden, but these are Villa de Papiri statues. Why this one is a third of the price of this one, there's a bargain for you. If you don't have tens of thousands, I was in Paris earlier in the year, and in a curio shop, there were two different versions of the Mercury, large and small, both somewhat beyond my budget. But it's not just bronze in which these have been reproduced. They've also been reproduced in plaster casts. This is the Stairway of Naples, the Art Academy. And this, I think, in some ways replicates that original installation that Goethe and Winkelmann talk about in the staircase in the museum in Portici before they were moved to Naples. And after the king of Naples became the king of Spain, he had plaster casts of everything sent to him. So in Madrid, there's a very good collection of plaster casts of the statues. And here you see the drunken satyr. The cast has been damaged. Plaster is quite fragile. But for academic reasons, throughout the world, the Villa de Papiri sculpture is represented. This is the Oxford University cast collection, and you can see there's a small display devoted to Roman villas where we get one of the dancers and the Amazon and the Doryphros. These are all plasters that have been painted to look like bronze. The Spinario, I don't know why he's there, but the others have been put in typological sections. So the Mercury with all the men, and this dancer with all the women. Meanwhile, new technologies have allowed for different kinds of reproduction. Strangely, the Naples Museum has decided to put the pan and the goat. Well, it's not so strange, it's a matter of popular appeal. It's in their so-called Gabinetto Segreto, the secret cabinet of pornographic works, which is pseudo-historical about this room that was only open originally to men or to special visitors. Now it's very popular, so they've created this kind of 19th century display, and they have the pan and the goat in the corner. But the pan and the goat also appears in the Villa de Papiri galleries. That's because they've laser scanned it and 3D printed it. And so this is the original, and this is the 3D print, which is really very high quality, but the surface is kind of glossy and pasty. So I have to be careful to get this one. I don't know. And the latest is doing 3D scans of the bronzes to make molds. They can cast through traditional techniques very good replicas rather than what the Kierazzi did. Other foundries are casting, and they just last year, I think earlier this year, installed in the Naples airport in the arrivals terminal kind of advertisement for the museum having the Hermes. And this is a projection on the wall. If I were more technologically savvy, I'd have a video, but you can see he comes down, this projection moves, and, oops, sorry, go back and forth, see he moves down. And so Mercury there lands just as you, as the visitor to the airport, has just arrived to this place. And, you know, it's interesting, so this idea of replicating the sculptures and sending them around, I think is very fitting because so many of the statues that we can identify from the Villa dei Papiri, they're ancient replicas of earlier Greek works. And so now we've got, you know, modern copies of ancient copies of earlier Greek works that are being moved around the world for different agendas, so people can tell different stories about, you know, their culture, their cultural aspirations, their intellectual aspirations, being repurposed in the new context using new technologies, which is pretty much what Lucius Calpurnius Piso and his son were doing when they amassed this collection for their villa. So it's very modern and I think appropriate use of these works. And with that, I thank you for your attention and I welcome your questions. Yes. The question is, were any of the statues painted? The bronzes would have, you know, they had inlaid eyes, they would have been patinated, so the bronzes would have been colored. The marbles may well have been painted. The new excavations at Herculaneum have, they discovered another Amazon head that had, I don't have a slide of it, had a lot of paint, painted eyelashes, painted hair. The marbles probably were. The problem is everything that was discovered in the 18th century, it came out, it was dirty, it was black, so let's put it in the water, let's scrub it, and so a lot of the traces of Philippine are lost. But they most likely were painted, and we have other painted sculptures on the site. Yes, sir.
There's miles and miles of this coastline, presumably covered with mud. But what are people, are there any new excavations going on?
The question is miles and miles of coastline covered by volcanic debris, and are there new excavations? Yes, last time I showed you Positano on the other side of the peninsula, where they were doing work in the basement of the church, and they found remains of a Roman villa. And there are other points where work is going on. The challenges are many. One, the volcanic debris is so deep, there's a lot to go through. But along the coast, there's also erosion, so things get exposed by the sea. There are, I think, challenges and different agendas about new excavation. There are people who want to re-excavate and do further excavations at the Villa dei Papiri to find more sculpture, to find more papyri. Well, maybe you don't want more papyri. But there's also the ongoing difficulty of conserving what we have as what we've exposed and we're responsible for is, you know, there's wind, there's rain, pollen and seeds get blown by the wind and dirt accumulates and weeds start growing and setting down roots in mosaics and they get destroyed. So before we, a lot of people believe that before we start excavating more, we need to preserve what we have and we need to have a plan for conservation for the new excavations, and that's much more expensive than just the digging. But the whole coastline, we know both from the archaeology here and there, but also from literary sources, was just lined. It was like a whole city on the coast, and we see that in the wall paintings. So there are lots of villas everywhere, and they might well have sculpture collections, they might well even have libraries, but this is the only one that's been found on this scale. Yes?
The wonderful little happy Epicurean pig
Yes.
is quite a balancing feat. Would he have had his front feet up on something, or would he have been displayed on his back feet?
Well, that's a good question. It's that the Epicurean pig is up on his back feet balanced. And one thing that's very interesting is there are different replicas of that done by the Chiarazzi, and it can be mounted different, they can mount it different ways. And also depending on how you finish a bronze in terms of polish and cold work, something from the same molds could look quite different. That's not quite addressing your question, but bronze and the replication of bronze gives you various possibilities. But bronze has great, great tensile strength, which is why you can have something like the statue in Piccadilly Circus doing this on tiptoe, right? So it could very easily stand up on its own. I haven't done a thorough study of that figure to figure out what's the right angle, but I think it would have been up on its toes like that. And that, interestingly, is very similar to what we saw in the silver cup, where the pig is up. So I think that gives us I don't think it would have been down on all fours. I think it would have been perched up. I think there was a question in front. Yes?
Is Vesuvius still active? Is there any chance that it could come to cover again everything that has been excavated?
So the question is, Vesuvius active, and could there be another eruption covering everything? And absolutely yes. I mean, Vesuvius is very, very closely monitored because you've got millions of people living in the Bay of Naples. And throughout the 18th and 19th century, it was erupting quite regularly, small eruptions. I showed you the volcano painting. Tourists would go and visit the eruptions. They'd take coins and press them in the lava and bring home souvenirs and whatnot. The last big eruption was in World War II, and there's film footage. And it's a funny story that the greatest damage to Allied aircraft was Vesuvius. The Allies accidentally, without not having precision bombing, trying to cut off German escape routes, bombed some of Pompeii, and it seemed that Vesuvius got its revenge, erupted, and the canvas and plexiglass of the planes was melted by the ash. And if you Google Vesuvian eruption 1945, you'll see BBC footage. But those were much smaller eruptions, although very damaging, than the big Plinian eruption of 79, which was massive. But people are very worried that the volcano is kind of overdue for an eruption, and depending on which way the wind is blowing and the force of the eruption, Naples is north, and generally the winds blow from the north to the south, but Herculaneum, Pompeii, Naples, and a lot of the urbanization that has really filled in the area would be at risk, and it's really we've seen all these disasters in our hemisphere, but it's a great worry for civil defense and things now. Yeah. But what hasn't been excavated would just be buried further, as we saw, it's what's been excavated. There's an argument for doing nothing. It's safe so long as it's down there. Yes?
I'm interested in that sundial that's shaped like a ham.
Yeah.
And how big is it?
It's a pocket thing. It's this big. Yeah.
Well, you better get that one. I want to see it.
Well, it's on my list. But when I meet the director of the Naples Museum in 2 weeks, I'll tell him that you want it. It was recently on display in New York. There was a small exhibition at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU on ancient timekeeping, and they got it from Naples. So this means it has a box it can travel with. It's been in terms of conservation, it's stable and it can travel. The flip side is they can say, well, it was just a way, we don't want to send it again. But I'm asking for 2 years' time. I don't want to say anything's going to happen, but I think that's one of the easier asks.
So, not to deny you the possibility of talking to us longer, because I know that you all enjoy him so much, but I don't want to tax you over much. But thank you so much for this incredible journey.
Thank you. And I hope to see you all in Malibu in 2019, where we'll have several of these objects.